Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this very, very lovely convening featuring the creative and artistic team behind MEPAAN, the opening show of SIFA 2022. And I have here with us today six very lovely creatives, three of us whom we have the privilege of having in person. So first off, we have Maestro Tsung, who is also the music director for MEPAAN. And we have three composers with us, two of whom are in the room. We have Mr. Eric Watson, and then we have Wang, Chenwei. And joining us virtually, we have Juvita and Adrian from Sarawak and of the Tuyang initiative. And finally, we also have the very lovely composer, Koh Cheng Jin. So I guess just to start off the conversation, because this is something that kind of fermented in me as I got to know the project and the music and looking at the materials, at the concepts. And I just want to begin by asking Maestro, how has the vision for MEPAAN evolved, whether it is musically or just conceptually from when it is first conceived? Has there been this very progressive sense of evolution, or has it remained remarkably consistent?
Well, the story actually you can trace back to 2019, the end of 2019, before the pandemic started. About to start her position, Natalie Hannidage, and she asked me for a lunch somewhere behind the SEO building. So we talk about that. I say, hey, Natalie, what's your future plan for that time? She's supposed to start the year after that, but nobody knows. It's actually delayed 2-3 years later. She say, I want to have something, close to ritual, and in particular the native people. Wow, that's burned fire in my heart, because that's a subject we've been, talk about and being search about. And this, because since 2002, my journey into Singapore is I always want to create a good repertoire for Singapore Chinese orchestra, and with a Singapore character. In order to do that, we commissioned many, many works, and then also work with the composers such as Eric Watson and Wang Chenwei. We actually conducted a few field trips into Sarawak, Sabah, Indonesia, southern China. And there are so many things I want to work with, this subject. But what's important thing is the close relationship the native people had with great nature. Whether you call God or you call heaven, you call land, whatever. But this something moved me very much. So when Natalie say ritual, it opened my eyes. Yes, that's the subject we should start. That's how we start this whole thing. That said, can we have a program together? And then we, take time to talk about. Then we start to structure how to put the things together. First of all, this must be a concert somewhat, but you don't want to be a traditional concert. Go there, conduct, and peace, and cross, bye. But I want something with, music as the main body, but then also can open people's eyes to something very near you. And so first of all, I spent quite some time to search what is the existing piece. I took two pieces, one called Ho Tu by composer Tang Jianping, written probably 1990s. Yeah, and derived from some southern mountain sound from minority in China. Then also I took a piece called Across the Southern Asia's Islands, which is a winging piece from our composition competition by a Chinese composer. Then I envisioned 3 commission work, and with 3 composers, they are all here today. And the opening piece by Mr. Eric Watson, Sunrise Island Country. Yes. Then the ending piece by Wang Chenwei, March to Eternity. And then we have a lovely serenade by Koh Cheng Jin, Song of Night Wings. So first piece, and then 2 existing pieces, and the Koh Cheng Jin serenade. Finally, Wang Chenwei's march formed the whole 5 movements. And right now, actually, the piece is more or less worked. We had two reading session, and then also afterwards, it's not going to be just playing notes. There will be light, stage design, and the particular location in Pasir power station, which opened a new territory to us, offers something very different. So I'm quite excited, but most importantly, we actually had a wonderful experience with Tuyang people. They did, yes, and Juvita and Adrian and also Uncle Matthew, they joined us in Singapore. We had a 2 days workshop with them. Oh, this is some eye-opening experience. And they really showed us that how do they work with Mother Nature. Yeah, and I feel from what they told us, whether musically or by language, they're very close to Mother Nature. And the way they handle this is something we want to bring to the world, because that kind of relationship, human being close to Mother Nature, has been destroyed or damaged for many years. And we're so happy to see that kind of relationship from Tuyang. And so this is really the theme we want to show through these 5 pieces and the MEPAAN, is how the native people in this island country to work with Mother Nature, yeah, and closely, and then bring the whole society to the future. So it is really a good journey, and I'm continuously to be excited and recharged by what I have learned, and from 2 composers from Tuyang here, and also working with the whole team. And that's one thing I can tell or whoever watched this, is this is going to be a very different production. You can hear music, you can see things happen, you can feel things happen. You will like to be jumping up afterwards.
Thank you so much for that, Maestro. I think in a way, what you are speaking about is also pointing to, I would say, a certain kind of cultural trajectory of, us realizing that, far from the confines of the somewhat institutional, rigid spaces, for example, of traditional concert halls, traditional repertoires, I think, what MEPAAN and what you and the team have been getting at is, is the idea of music as this embodied and effective experience of, music being able to provoke these senses and ideas of the transcendental. And these ideas of being transcendent, I think is also something, of course, that we see in a lot of ritual music, in a lot of sacred music, and of course in a lot of folk songs and songs from the indigenous people of the various countries and continents, of the idea of being able to reach a certain state of communion with a higher power, whatever that may be, however that might be typified. And I guess this is on this note that I want to ask the lovely composers that we have with us today, of how then, do you work with different structures, different conventions, different ways of making sound, and of course then, the different ways of listening that you have to engage in order to compose. Because as we all understand, when indigenous communities, with, every other communities, oral traditions are almost always present, because this is how human civilization, of how humanity propagates itself. But what is interesting is that when we think about oral traditions and oral history, most of the time we think of oral with O, because it is spoken, before it is articulated. But sometimes, we don't realize necessarily that oral can also mean A-U-R-A-L. Because when you speak, someone has to listen, someone has to receive, someone has to interpret. And I am very curious, because almost all of you are working then in the format of commission of developing a new syncretized kind of sonic language. And perhaps each of you can just share with us a little bit more on how did you work with your initial concept, and how did you bring in or inject different elements from these different works and cultures that you have encountered throughout the creative process. And maybe we can go chronologically, and we can start with Eric.
Sure. I think my own approach has been based on a very personal experience I had when I actually first came to Singapore, in point of fact. Now, at that particular point, my background was not entirely Western orientated, but a very large part of it was. I mean, I was aware of music of other cultures as a musician, and particularly also because I'd worked a lot in musicals, which the whole range of sort of material there. So I wasn't unfamiliar. But until I came to Singapore and actually saw the reality of it, as it were, going around as an everyday function, I hadn't quite encountered that. So the first thing really for me was, in fact, is to immerse myself in what is actually happening. And that's always been my approach from that moment onwards. So I didn't know anything much about the nuts and bolts of Chinese orchestra music, for instance. I liked the sound, I heard the differences, that sort of thing. But how is it put together? Where does it come from? What's the structure? Exactly what you're talking about. Where are these things coming from? How have they been arrived at? So I needed to find out about those kinds of things. But before I actually went and spoke to people, I just listened. I went to concerts. I went to the Chinese orchestra. I believe it was called the People's Association Orchestra at that particular moment in time. And then, of course, it evolved later and became what it is, this wonderful orchestra that it is now. But I also was listening to gamelan and going overseas, actually, to Indonesia to see gamelan. Also, seeing some of it in Malaysia. So I was actively sort of immersing myself in that material, even though Wang, I remember the streets of Penang at one particular point. I sort of managed to weasel my way inside at the backstage to see what was happening, bearing in mind that my own background is actually quite theatrical in many ways. So it was an eye-opener to me exactly what was going on behind the scenes, because it's quite different. Although the fundamentals are kind of the same, the way it actually happens are quite different. So those are the things I try to discover. And I threw it by listening. First of all, you're talking about oral tradition. That's what my ears are for. I listen to the material and I start coming eventually over a period of time to certain conclusions. Only after that point then I start asking questions almost to test my conclusions. Am I right about this? Am I right about that? I got a lot of things wrong, of course, but also I did get a lot of things right. This part of ritual and everyday life became very apparent, for instance, when I was working with some gamelan musicians. And this is very much an oral tradition. They don't really write the music down at all. You might have just one line written in SIFA notation, numbers, and that's it. Everything else is orally put together along fairly explicit guidelines, with some leeway, of course, as to where notes may go, etc. So I began making the question, why do you choose this note rather than etc. And of course, it's dependent upon what is happening in the music, which is not in many ways unlike Western music, where one note comes from really does depend upon where it's come from, what the context is, what's going to happen. But there was also one very great fundamental difference I discovered about folk music per se. And I'm bringing this up because obviously it's relevant in this instance. In the Western tradition, we use folk music, but not to anywhere near the same extent as it's used, for instance, in Chinese music, which probably maybe as much as 80% of music is based upon a folk tune of some kind, or there'll be a reference to it. In European music, it's probably the other way opposite way around, more like 20%. And then the rest of it is what we would call abstract or pure music, whatever that means. Pure music. It's like distilling it, isn't it? A little bit of this. Anyway. So the idea of music that comes from the people as being part of all music is quite a big Eastern concept rather than so much a Western concept. I mean, there are similarities and one can trace patterns as well. So I don't want to be too iconoclastic here and say this or that, but nonetheless, there was that fundamental difference. So it also affects the structure, you see. It affects it in many different ways. Just how you put the notes, simply the notes that you put together. Sometimes the scales and the modes that are selected, because which comes first sometimes, there's a mode. Some musicologists come along and say, oh, this is this mode. I've written it down from that. I'm sure the original folk singer didn't say, I'm going to use this mode, and it's got to be this note, got to be. They just sang. At some point, they just put it together. Or they had a need, often a ritualistic need, to celebrate something. So then it was put together. So I started finding out all these little bits and pieces. And rather than sort of consciously imitating these things, I've thought about the principle behind it, why it would actually occur. And I tried to use that in my compositional procedures. And I've always kind of done that from that moment onwards. At the same time, it taught me the value, in fact, of this oral tradition. Now, in the West, we have an oral tradition. So we're not all stuck with notation. It's very much a part of our culture, musical culture, even classical music culture. Even the teacher, the guru, student sort of relationship that exists in the West as well as in the East here. I mean, the teacher will play something and the student imitates it. He doesn't look at the notes and say, what have you done, what have you done? He hears what's going on. And there's what we call performance practice in the West, which means there are certain ways of playing it which are kind of part of the period that it comes from, a particular inflection, a particular way of accenting, a particular way of phrasing. A great example is jazz, for instance, which quite often, if you look at the way it's written to a classical musician, it doesn't sound like that when it's played by a jazz musician. But the jazz musician, that performance practice is part of it's an oral tradition. He's inherited it, sometimes actually invented it and then passed it on, in early days. So this is all sort of part and parcel of my thinking as I'm going along. And then when it comes to the actual commission in this particular case, again, I have to sit down, I have to think quite hard and immerse myself. So I was listening to a lot of songs from Sarawak, from actually all of Borneo, not just Sarawak, because there's a lot of intermingling of cultures. So quite often you get something popping up in one place which, oh, I heard that somewhere else. That's and these kind of things. So eventually you get some ideas, you begin to get the flavor, as it were, in a way. And again, without slavishly imitating, I try to find a way to involve that flavor, as it were, in what I'm doing. Then, obviously, having talked about what the purpose of the actual commission is, that helps. I mean, this is quite specific. The title is Island Sunrise. So that's what I need to be thinking about. So, I mean, I started listening to a lot of songs from Kenyan songs, Sarawak songs, all sorts of things. And some kind of were, in a way, seemed to be morning songs, some seemed to be more evening songs, that sort of thing. So I'm listening for that kind of thing as well, because I actually don't want to sort of place something in the wrong place, do something which would not be part of the culture, because that doesn't work either. So I mean, in the end, you never know what you've succeeded until it gets going, you know. So then I start writing, and as with all of these things, I find that there's at some point where the composition almost takes on a life of its own, and it wants to go in certain directions. Sometimes it wants to go in a direction that I don't want it to, so then I have to sort of force the head around, yank the horse's head around in the right direction, as it were. But a lot of the time, that direction comes from the composition itself, and then that can be very creative because it can give you this sudden burst of direction and thought and a flowering of creative process, because it sparks off other things along the way. So I kind of look forward for that moment, and in many ways, quite often, before that actually happens, I'm kind of casting around a little bit, sort of trying, you know, thinking about this, and then discarding stuff, etc. And then suddenly, I find with most compositions, that point arrives. Sometimes it's harder than others, but in others it isn't. And then a structure begins to emerge. Again, I try to avoid, for the most part, imposing a structure, but at the same time, I have to find what works well for the piece. And I know that there are certain procedures, for instance, which will give logical conclusions or logical progression, etc. But for me, it's always a long period of continually questioning. What is this? Do I need to go? Do I want to do this? Are these the right? Is this the right instrument? Is this the right kind of sound, etc. All of the time, there's this is part of the creative process. Not because I'm doubting so much as I'm trying to get, if you like it, the truth of where I'm at.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And in a way, you know, it really got me thinking of how I think a common refrain in certain forms of anthropological inquiries, we were always thinking about, you know, the ideas of technologies and, you know, what can be constituted, what can be considered as a technology. And I mean, one of the earliest way to go into the somewhat more meta aspect of it is that language is technology. Music is technology. The way that music notation, I think the entire field of contemporary musicianship, even if you are working with traditional or classical or historical forms, there's almost something programmatic about that, because, you know, it is technical, it is almost mathematical, but there is almost always that, you know, that animate spark, that indeterminable spark of human spirit that runs through it, that suddenly makes that mechanical beast start moving and start breathing and start having its life within, you know, the circulation of human ideas. And I'm really thankful for the way that you have also brought up pretty elegantly. And yeah, I guess also continuing in this trajectory, then I'm also curious, of course, to ask Cheng Jin and Chenwei, you know, in your own compositional process, and, you know, having, or rather being someone who exists in this kind of contemporary era, you know, who may not have that, say, the decades of amalgamation of experiences and worlds and cosmologies, as that, say, Maestro or Eric has undergone, you know, in your own explorations, how has that process been? And I guess we can start with Cheng Jin.
Ladies first.
Chronological.
Hi, thank you so much for the question and the insightful sharing by Mr. Watson. For me, sorry, I need to sit behind. Yeah. For me, I know that I have been a very westernized composer in terms of my training and my craft. I've been so urbanized and so isolated in this regard that I feel like I was lacking a lot of that natural energy that's associated with a lot of the indigenous musicians that we see and hear today. So for me, I had to actually really alienate myself for a couple of days, and just to really immerse myself like with Mr. Watson's terms, like to immerse myself in the music of the culture that I am supposedly studying and being inspired by. So what I did was when I was writing my piece, I actually wrote it during my 3-week quarantine at the hotel in Singapore. And I was heavily jet lagged. I just came back from New York for a bit and to visit my family, and I was jet lagged. So I was up like from 11 p.m. all the way to 8 a.m. in the morning. So that was actually the best time for me to compose. And thankfully, my piece is also called Song of the Night Wind. It's related to the night.
Exactly.
So it actually enhances like my whole sensation of writing it. Yeah, and when I was writing it, I was actually hearing a few examples of music I could source online because I lacked the experience of going to the culture itself to hear it in person, and that's a big loss on my part because I wasn't able to do that beforehand. So I had to research a little bit, I had to work a little bit harder to try to listen to the few examples I could find, which is just a small part of the culture. And there's so much more that I haven't really been cognizant of yet. So I was just trying to listen to a bit, and what I love immediately about the culture is the sounds and the atmosphere that they're able to produce. It's very calming, very soothing. And even if the text is intense and dramatic, the song, the melody is still very soothing and still meditative, in my humble opinion. And I wanted to capture that in my music first of all. So I wanted to preserve and to respect the essence as much as I could. And I also had to research a little bit more on the background, the culture and the history of the area that I'm looking at. So just now, I think you mentioned about the Chong Pek Lin's dissertation. So I was also searching about it, and she actually is a Malaysian researcher and has done a lot of field work in the region. And the dissertation is a combination of 7 years of research and close study in 7 Kenya villages. So I really found it so resourceful and so helpful in my approach to this. And in the dissertation, she transcribed so many songs with English translations, and that really helped me a lot because I couldn't understand the original beautiful language. That's also another loss. So a lot of losses I had to contend with. So she translates all of them, and I actually looked up the song as much as I can, like one by one, just to hear it in their original context. Like a lot of them couldn't be found and accessed online, obviously. But there's one that particularly struck me. It's a love duet, a love song. So I used the song in my piece as the main melody. And you could hear it in the strings mostly because it's a very song-like lyrical entity. And a lot of times I feel that the song-like, the lyrical soulfulness of the music is what I really hope to capture in my music. So I use it as the basis of my piece. But usually when I write music with folk songs or with songs taken from another tradition like Chinese, because I play the Chinese instrument, so sometimes I may use certain Chinese idioms in my piece. Usually I would like to break it down and to invent it and to be like be more contrapuntal with it, for example. But in this context, I didn't want that kind of texture to convolute the essence. So I was very careful, and I wanted to preserve the melody in its whole entirety before I do anything to it. And I make sure I treat it carefully and to let it express itself in full first, and not to invent it or deliberately manipulate it the way I would, like with some of my other pieces. So this is also another learning experience for me. So to summarize, my approach is usually to also immerse myself first in the little bit of culture that I could gain access to, and to translate their sounds, their textures into the medium that I'm given, which is the Chinese orchestra, which is extremely multifaceted and colorful and wide-ranging. So I was so contented that I was able to do that and to contribute a little bit to the sound world that I'm creating.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cheng Jin, for sharing that. And I'm pretty sure, as all of us here who have worked in creative capacities continually, currently, or in some way or another before, there is that very precise hour from 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. when you are on the verge of losing lucidity, but that's also when some sort of inspiration usually strikes. So you need to hurry and, make sure it manifests before you just conk out and nearly die at your desk. So I think it is something that we all empathize with, and we thank you for your sacrifices. We hope your liver is in a better condition now. And yeah, and I think one particular idea that you have mentioned, or rather two ideas that you have mentioned, one on working with respect. I think that is something that is really important because we also understand the idea of indigenous cultures, indigenous worlds, indigenous contents, indigenous communities and people. We don't exist in silos. We exist in our material context. We exist in our context of society, politics, economies. And I think the idea of respect is really, really central then to any form of collaboration, because to create equitably, we need to make sure that everyone has a similar term of engagement. If not, it is really hard to do that thing that we call living together and living together well. So it is great to know, to have you mention that particular note and sensitivity, because it also brings to mind, for example, when you mentioned, wanting to preserve the integrity of the main melody, it reminds me then, maybe it's an apt metaphor or not, of weaving. Because when we weave, we bring together different fibers, we create fabrics with it. And as we know, weaving is also a really important part of most indigenous material cultures. With woven textures, woven products, woven matter that permeates not just theirs, but also our way of lives. If we can just count how many people in the tropics have a rattan basket, for example. and to think of it, I think in music, in sound making, in creating worlds through sound, the idea of weaving for me also holds, I guess, a certain kind of texture, because it is about bringing things together harmoniously without losing their core essence. Because you don't lose the strands when you weave, but the strands remain whole and remain the main constituents. And if you bother looking deeply, if you bother listening deeply, this is also when you can find that very granular texture that ultimately is what holds everything together. And yeah, I guess, beyond that very meandering roundabout tangent, I'm also really curious to ask Chenwei, on your process, with your work, rounding off the production as a whole, and working through commissions and the confines of, thinking through something entirely new that must come from a respectful place of something that has already come before. So how is it like for you?
Yeah. My whole formal music education was actually Western. So I studied composition in Vienna, Austria. But because ever since I joined the Chinese orchestra in secondary school, I've been deeply involved with the Chinese orchestra scene, and so I'm like straddling two different traditions. And what I find is actually folk music, usually in the eyes of academics, like folk music is assumed to be simple, but when you actually try to do it, you realize it's not simple at all. And the reason is because
Bartok found that out too.
and the reason is because they place emphasis on different parameters as what academic composers would place emphasis on. So maybe in Western music we'll look at things like the intonation, the rhythm, right there, and the harmony, the form, right. But there are a lot of specific requirements and nuances in various folk musical genres that whereby these might not be the only parameters you look at, or maybe the music is appears to be simple in these parameters that Westerners look at, but there are other parameters like ornamentation, the style, spiritual aspects, etc. That whereby someone learning Western music would not be aware of, and because of this unawareness, then and they just listen to it, they don't know what it actually means. Then they say it's simple, right? So in this regard, actually, I will take the folk music of any tradition very seriously, and also take time to try to study it. And actually, it's actually I find this quite difficult to handle also, because basically when I'm studying folk music, I can put aside all my university training, right? And because and a lot of things actually I have to start learning from scratch again, and put aside all my preconceptions and look at it as it is, and as how it exists in its original context. Yeah, so I've done work with many types of cultural traditions, so from Chinese to Malay, Indian, Arab, and now because of this project, I have the opportunity to do something related to the indigenous peoples of Borneo. For my background research, I went to like borrow CDs of the music of the whole Indonesia, which then you actually, it's surprising how much. Okay, actually, it's not surprising how much diversity there is. Because when usually from outsiders' perspective, we only think of Indonesia equals Milang, which is it is not true. I mean, it's just it is one of the most representative and most well-known genres, but that's not the only one. And so across all the whole archipelago, each island has its own musical genre or genres, right? That was like sort of to get an overall impression, and more specifically, I thank the Tuyang initiative for providing the recordings, like they like a recorded song named Mesai Movit, and another song named Pabat Pibui. So the Pabat Pibui was played with sape by Mr. Salomon Gao. So I actually looked at the video and transcribed all the notes that he played, and including all the ornaments. So that is actually a very important aspect, because the ornamentation forms an important aspect of most non-Western folk traditions, right? And then I played a Chinese instrument called a ruan, which is a flat string instrument. So I tried to replicate the sound. Okay, so watch a video. Okay, so he did this and this, and I tried to say, okay, I will do this and this. Right? So that's how I tried to emulate the playing style of the sape. And of course, when they came to Singapore, I also eagerly had some hands-on experience with the sape and tried to play it too, right? My approach to the March to Eternity was that firstly, Maestro Ye shared his vision with me for a march that is not just a one person or two person or group, but encompassing the whole population of maritime Southeast Asia. So at last count, I think it's about 400 million, right? And I think this idea of the maritime Southeast Asia is important to us and for SCO too, because we have, as Maestro Ye spearheaded the Nanyang style since 20 years ago. And we look at the term Nanyang, so in Chinese it means the Southern Ocean, and so actually this term has a connotation that it has a Chinese lens to it. It's not just so if we say Southeast Asian music, it would be Southeast Asian music as it is. But when you say Nanyang, actually it involves a Chinese lens, and so therefore we are actually looking at maritime Southeast Asia from the perspective of Chinese orchestra, right? And so this project actually is, I would say, in this sense, it is very Nanyang in its character. So I tried to compose a march that is not a Western sounding march, but one that actually sounds has a strong character of like Southeast Asia, and so I took fragments of the melodies of these two songs, and then I tried to piece them together in various ways, but also not limited to just the melodies themselves, but try to expand them in terms of harmony and development, right? In ways that like develops the material further, and so that's my approach in general.
No, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that. Because I think what is so interesting, for example, when you mentioned Nanyang as Southern Ocean as having that sinophonic particularity and interpretation of this region, we also sometimes, fail to realize that, Southeast Asia itself is also an invented concept. It's explicitly Western. It's a Cold War construct. So then, because of the kind of institutions that we experience, that we go through, that we join, and then we leave, and then we join again, or the kind of positionality that we embody in the way we think, in the way we speak. We're speaking English right now. What does that imply? What kind of colonial history and impetus did it presuppose? I think, what you have mentioned of having that different particularities and that different nuance then becomes something that's very apparent and also something that's very important. Because if we want to think about, particularly when you're mentioning, having to throw away your university notes sometimes, is because a lot of indigenous musical culture or sonic cultures elude the kind of empiricism that has permeated basically most forms of Western pedagogy, because it is derived from the historical trajectory and desire of the empire to quantify, to collect, to break down, to be reproducible on terms of engagements that are not equal. So when you talk about having to throw away the textbooks, I think that is also a particularly powerful moment, because in a way it is also reclaiming the specific performance strategies and pedagogies of this indigenous musical cultures that often comes from the position of a community, of almost like an apprenticeship, or if you want to avoid something more formalized as apprenticeship, the idea of coming together, of learning from an elder. I was recently, thinking about a particular essay that I was writing, and I wanted to call someone the big kahuna. And then I realized that no, I can't. Because a kahuna is a Hawaiian term that had a very specific cultural and socio-political underpinning. And just because there happens to be some sort of aberrant visual culture media out there called the Great Kahuna doesn't necessarily mean that I'm entitled to that same vernacular, even though it is so much embedded within this kind of discourse of American English and consciousness. And of course, this also brings us then, to our lovely two young, brilliant minds of the Tuyang initiative with Juvita and Adrian, where I also have a couple of questions, and I want to ask, because of my own interest, for example, in current Native American studies, there's this term called survivance. It is a way of surviving, or it is a way of being that exists outside of the modes of victimry. Because to have survivance, you need to have agency, you need to claim agency, and you are recognizing your own agency and existing outside of the paradigm of the exploitations and the violences. And I think, with cultural exchanges such as this, even though, of course, we may still be working with, certain embedded power differentials, that let's not forget, SIFA is a national arts festival, and, and such infrastructures may or may not exist in Malaysia, let alone, certain sort of peripherized discourses. Because why then Peninsular Malaysia versus East Malaysia? Why not just Malaysia's? And then it also brings up interesting histories of, a Bornean identity. And I guess these are all very, very loaded and dense, but I guess just to start things off, I want to ask Juvita and Adrian on, the initial ways of collaborating. What are some of your wariness, if any? What are some of your cautions? And how did you work through it? Do you still hold certain reservation? Because there's no absolutely equal exchanges. And of course, how was that process of creating together like for the both of you?
Okay, so yeah, it's on our part, I think it's been it's truly a learning process for us, because a lot of aspects of our practices are, deep down, it's still known that it's practical and it served a purpose and it had its reasons, for being sung, or a certain practice is done, So it's a lot of times we're conscious of that, but we also exist in this world and space right now where we're putting a performance of a ritual, So having all these bits at the back of our minds, we try and think about the songs that we call or melodies that come from a place where, talking to the composers, talking to maestro, understanding where we want to take this piece, and from there kind of build that linkage through the archive of our minds and our elders, So I think that was kind of like the process that we initially started with, and a lot of this. So like in the, to kind of like, I don't know if it's about drawing a parallel, but in the case of our archive or our elders' knowledge, talking about the great nature is it's existent in the words that are sung, the references that's made, like Masai Muid is about paddling down a river, and it's about teaching the younger generation the dangers of certain parts of the river and to be mindful of that, So these are that's just one song, and then in Pabat Piboy you have references of birds and specific birds and their behavior and how that mimics in human life, and so these linkages are always there. It's a matter of us identifying then, like where can it be, I suppose, interwoven into this greater, bigger piece, right? So yeah, I think we had a great initial meeting via Zoom last year with Maestro Ye, and we brought together a bunch of wonderful practitioners from all over Sarawak, from various oral traditions, from the Iban community, and then we have Adrian from the Kayan community, and we also brought a couple of Kenyang practitioners as well as Kenyang musicians. And from there, I think it was just more of a general understanding of how certain moods are set, and for us as from the Tuyang side to kind of facilitate that conversation, because a lot of time our practitioners don't think in that mode necessarily. It's about, we're singing this because we're happy and this is a celebration. It's not really about like how can we achieve this sound in this particular mood, or so we kind of understanding that, and understanding, I think, again, a little bit of the archive, we kind of steered them in trying to draw out what's available, and that's how the conversation kind of started, and how some of the songs and melodies were drawn out as well. So yeah, I think that was how it flowed, and then eventually the journey came to us being in Singapore and working on the visual aspect as well, and how Adrian and Matthew was able to lend the live element, the live vocal element, which I think is also very important for a lot of people to hear and understand the delivery and the words that are sung, even though it is not necessarily understood by the audience. I think the spirit of the delivery and how it is done will be able to bring everybody together in that sense of that. I don't know if we'll achieve communion, but yeah, I think that is the aim for this piece. But yeah, I think that's kind of how we hope for everything to kind of come together. Adrian?
Well, I guess you shared perhaps for like a better words the general feels of the whole process, but I guess I'll go on mine on I guess a bit on a personal level. Well, for us, like Maestro said earlier, in our connection to nature, and you know, all this, we don't have this, I would say, well, not really a structure. For us, it's more of it's what you feel that time. It's what you see that time. You know, that's what we hear that time. There's no notation. You sing this, you sing that. No, everybody just comes together, right? So it's the same thing that I feel in this that we're doing with MEPAAN. I think one of the most interesting thing was just to finding the title of the piece. I had to open up all the Kayan dictionary that I have, including including the live dictionary. I'm known as a living Kayan archive among my peers, but no, I don't remember everything. Yeah. We went with that MEPAAN. It comes actually from the. It hits me. It struck me when it was from my journey when I went to Indonesia and the Kayan community there in Kalimantan, Borneo. It was during one of the rituals. They were marching and singing and doing all this kind of praising to the spirits and all that. And one part they were talking about may we be blessed wherever and always, which is MEPAAN, hangan MEPAAN layo in our language. So I just went, yes, this is it. And going into I guess the most specifics when we were in Singapore, the conversation with Maestro Eric, and, Chenwei and everyone there. It's an interesting process seeing how the like you say, Alfonse. There's something that I call an ethical dilemma in a sense. So if you have your own reservations of the things that you share to each other, I'm sure Maestro, Mr. Eric, or everyone else there would have that as well. You know, when it comes to this kind of aspect, we were just trying bits and pieces like. Can you sing this song, as Maestro said? Can we do it here? No, we can't, because it's a lot of reasons. But I put it as so the exchange is more on I guess the challenge was ethical dilemma. There's some things you feel guilty of not telling, but you want to tell, but you can't tell. In that sense. So well, the rest of it was. Just working out with Natalie on this movement that I'm not familiar with all this, like you go with Chiu and everything. For us, when you hear a sapek playing, music is echo around the longhouse. You stand up or you pull someone up and they go to dance. You invite them to dance. So it's a learning process, as Juvita said. It's a whole learning process. Even when I started to learn what I practice. So yeah, I guess it's pretty exciting. And then the whole process is pretty exciting until up to this point, I guess. So yeah.
May I add in a little bit? Yeah. May I add in? When we are structuring the whole thing together, 5 pieces. But 5 pieces can be split into 5 different directions. It can be a chop suey, which we don't want it. But, through our work, research, finally I find something unify us. What? MEPAAN. And from Tuyang. And after we work with them through, online things, first of all, we find music elements to unify. Right. And so I think Eric in the first movement, and also Wang Chenwei, the last movement, they used some music element. It may not be a very obvious melody. Sometimes could be a motive, can be 2 notes, can be 3 notes, maybe can be a rhythm. But from beginning to the end, there's something you can feel is arch structure helped by MEPAAN, and not to mention the title of the whole concert, MEPAAN, from them. And actually, Cheng Jin is the music materials nearby enough, right? From Borneo mountain area, so it's not far away. At least not from New York, not from London, right? Yeah. So that really helped us to hold things together musically and structurally, and become one.
Thank you so much for that, and for summing up in a way some of my sentiments, throughout this session. So thought, I would just want to offer maybe just a final little bit of reflection that really draws from what Juvita and Adrian shared. And I think there's a particular moment when Adrian talked about, MEPAAN in the context of finding out that, what it means as always. And I think that, as per our cultures, as per our arts, as per our musics, I think MEPAAN crystallizes, a very, very essential joy of being happy, of living, of celebrating, of being together always. And that's it. Thank you, everyone, for being with us, for listening through this entire session. And we are glad to welcome you here. Thank you so much.